Hello, everybody. So for those that were in the last session, I kind of gave you my quick overview of kind of my impressions. Every clean tech in the last 10 years has all had a little bit of a flavor. And as I mentioned with Catherine just a minute ago, seeing some of these folks that have built these, running these really large organizations, making big impact, has been one of the themes. The other thing I think has been really interesting to those who have gotten a chance to go to some of the sessions is the amount of entrepreneurial energy this year. I mean, really over the top, really cool technology, innovation, and honestly, we hear all these big challenges, especially from some of the utility speakers that talk about that, because I think it's real. But then you see this sort of creativity about how to solve problems. And it's not just delivering energy, it's finding ways to bring sustainability into everyone's lives around the country. So with that, I'm really particularly excited about introducing our next speaker. It's someone that kind of combines both of that. Someone that's taken a mission and an entrepreneurial edge and is delivering it at scale and changing paradigms and being disruptive, and I love it as an entrepreneur myself. So I want to introduce Donnel Baird. Donald is the founder of BlocPower, a climate tech company based in Brooklyn, New York, that analyzes, finances, and installs clean energy and decarbonization upgrades in buildings in underserved communities. BlocPower creates jobs for qualified local, low-income workers, energy savings for building owners, reduces carbon emissions and asthma rates, provides financial returns to investors. I mean, that's a lot to get done, right? It's good. In 2021, the company announced a historic partnership with Ithaca, New York to decarbonize 100% of the city's buildings, the first such project in the United States. BlocPower is backed by Caper Capital, Andreessen Horowitz, Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, Volo Earth Ventures. Donnel is a graduate of Duke University and Columbia Business School. He spent 4 years as a political and community organizer and 2 years managing a national initiative to leverage American Reinvestment and Recovery Act energy efficiency investments in underserved communities. He's a member of the board of directors of several organizations, including the New York Federal Reserve Bank 2nd District Board, the Climate Reality Project, the Coalition for Green Capital. Additionally, he serves on the advisory committee for the U.S. SEC Small Business Capital Formation, an award recipient of the Columbia Business School Entrepreneur of the Year in 2021, the National Venture Capital Association Startup Innovator of the Year in 2022, Time Magazine's inaugural Dreamer of the Year in 2022. In 2022, Fast Company named BlocPower the #4 most innovative company in the world. That's impressive. Time Magazine's 100 most influential companies and the 42nd most disruptive startup in the world by CNBC. With that amazing introduction, I want to introduce Donnel Baird.
Gosh, that introduction was really impressive, huh? Yeah. Well, lower your expectations, people. I really love the prior presentation. Wasn't that great? She did an excellent job. Got to go see that Barbie movie. So first things first, I did go to Duke. Oh, okay. I didn't like it while I was there, so So I actually, my girlfriend at the time dumped me because I used to root for the Duke basketball team to lose games because I was so frustrated with some of my fellow Duke classmates. I just want to see them cry after we lost a game. So I'm kind of back and forth. Now that I'm older and more mature, I do root for Duke on occasion, although this year I think Carolina's definitely got the better team, and so really wishing you guys the best in the tournament. Great game yesterday. You guys are looking good. We'll see what Baycott brings to the table. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about what brings us together. We're in the middle of a climate catastrophe, and it's up to you guys to figure out how we're going to work our way out of it and fight our way out of it, right? And that's why you're all here. So as I was thinking about this, I wanted to think about what was potentially most helpful for you all as young people. And I thought that since I'm now back in my third home state, North Carolina, where I spent several years and many of my best friends still live, that I would reflect upon what I've done over the last 10 years, 20 years since I left here, and what I've learned in terms of lessons that may or may not be useful to you all as you guys are thinking about your clean energy career and the kind of fight that you're in. We're leaving you guys a big mess, and want to try to be helpful in providing a little bit of guidance as best we can, from my perspective. Does that make sense? And I'll probably talk for like 10, 15 minutes and then open it up for questions so we can really make sure that I'm answering questions and concerns that you guys have. So when I was in college, I studied American history, which my parents were very upset about. But one of the things I focused on was the African American civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s in the Southeast, where students rose up, and the narrative that most of us have been taught hasn't been true. Actually, a bunch of the students here in Greensboro in North Carolina, but also in Nashville, they were trained for 18 months on Gandhian nonviolence before they ever first went to the first Woolworth counter and did a sit-in. There was 18 months of training, in addition to their schoolwork, that they did in order to prepare themselves. They did role-playing. They practiced calling each other the N-word. They poured salt and ketchup all over one another. They really tried to simulate what the experiences would be before they did that first sit-in to desegregate the Woolworths, what might happen and how might they best prepare for it. So there was a lot of work and training that went into that for 18 and 19-year-olds to get to the point to where they could participate in that civil rights movement in a way that makes sense. And they really did drive Dr. Martin Luther King into making decisions, sometimes being a little bit more aggressive than he was, or forcing him to be more aggressive than he wanted to be. So I'm saying all of that to talk about, I spent a lot of time while I was in school learning about the really critical role that young people played in African American civil rights and expanding civil rights to all Americans in the 60s. And that's kind of the framework that I use when I think about clean energy and what you guys are going to need to accomplish as your generation really takes over. So after studying that, I moved back to New York, which is where I lived as a kid with my parents, and I became a community organizer. I ended up working for the same folks that had trained Barack Obama 25 years before me. At the time, they were in Chicago, they were in New York. So I spent 2 or 3 years walking into low-income housing complexes and knocking on doors, trying to build relationships with families, and pushing and encouraging them to build up the courage to talk with the mayor or other elected officials about improving the school system, or asking for meetings with the police chiefs to improve the quality of life in the neighborhood. Really thinking about ways to push local leaders to get involved in their local community. And the truth is, that was really hard. There are a lot of days where I would go to work, and housing projects in New York are pretty dangerous and pretty scary. So there's some days I'd get to work and I wouldn't even be able to walk into the housing project and knock on doors. Or some days I would walk into the housing project, but I wouldn't be able to get all the way up to the stairs, and I'd stand and be about to knock on someone's door, but I'd be so afraid of knocking on the door and seeing who was going to answer it and seeing what all was going on that I wouldn't be able to pull it off. But there are other days where I was able to push through all of that and knock on the door and do my job and build relationships and push through it. And so for me, it was invaluable. Door-to-door sales early on, going door-to-door is a really valuable skill set. The other thing I learned early on is I didn't think I was quite qualified to get a real job like many of you are going to have. And so after a few years of community organizing, I also went into electoral politics in Brooklyn, working with local candidates to run their campaigns. And the interesting thing about political campaigns is young people, you can be 23, 24 years old, and you can be put in charge of the whole campaign. So you get a lot of management responsibility. You're in charge of the budget, you're in charge of communications, and so you can start to pick up lots of skills that are useful to you as a leader and manager later on in your career. So those were 2 things that I did right after college that were really helpful. And then one day, my community organizing mentors came to me and said, hey, we think you'd be really interested in this guy, Barack Obama. He's in the state Senate in Illinois. He's running for Senate. We think he's going to lose, but you should check him out, try to meet him. So I drove to Illinois, met with him, and he won the Senate seat, and then he said he was going to run for president. And I was like, oh, he's definitely going to lose when he's running for president. There's no way he's going to beat Hillary. But maybe if he loses to Hillary in like with grace and dignity, she'll pick him as vice president, and then he'll be the first black vice president. And so with that flawed political analysis, I joined the first Obama campaign and moved to rural South Carolina on the board of South Carolina and Georgia, where I registered voters and ran a voter operation, voter contact campaign. So I worked on that campaign for 18 months across 8 states, ending up in Pennsylvania in the general election. And once we won the election, they asked me, what do you want to do? Do you want to move to DC and join the government? I was like, nah, I don't think that's gonna be for me. I had started dating my wife. She was starting law school in New York at Columbia, and I didn't want to leave her to move to DC. I wanted to stay in New York. So I ended up taking a job with a coalition of labor unions, which is something that maybe they don't teach us as much about in the South. I certainly didn't know anything about them before I started working for them. But there's a coalition of labor unions that represented construction unions across America. And they had the idea that they were going to co-invest $90 billion of their pension assets in creating green municipal bonds back in 2008, 2009, to help the US Department of Energy go door to door to reduce carbon emissions in buildings. And the reason the labor unions were going to do this investment was they wanted to get the jobs. All of the jobs: caulking, air sealing, wrapping and replacing pipes, removing excess carbon monoxide, replacing windows, blowing insulation into the attic, putting in new LED lights. The labor unions wanted those to be union jobs. And in exchange for that, they were going to invest almost $100 billion alongside about $6 billion that President Obama and then Vice President Biden, through his middle class task force, had allocated to invest in greening buildings. And at the time, Dr. McCord, you may remember this, Energy Secretary was Secretary Chu, and he had this grand vision. We were going to have 18-wheeler trucks. They were going to be filled with organic insulation in the back of the truck, and we were just going to go house to house and blow insulation into the attic and into the walls and reduce emissions by 10, 11%. We were going to create 1 million construction jobs. We were going to reduce emissions. We were also going to move away from being reliant on foreign oil, because remember at that time we were still in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were still sending tons and tons of troops over there, and so trying to move out of that region and pull back was really important. So there are all these policy objectives that we thought that making these investments was going to accomplish. And of course, at the time we were facing a financial crisis. We had the 2008 subprime mortgage recession and collapse. We also, the Great Recession, I guess it's called now. We also at the time thought that, the single family home market was starting to collapse and cause the economic crisis. We thought that the office buildings, all the office buildings, were potentially going to collapse as well. So it wasn't quite clear what to do. So anyway, Obama decided they were going to invest, $787 billion in this thing called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to stabilize the Wall Street banks and stabilize the economy and the recession. And so they made that investment. And as part of that, the labor unions were hoping to partner with the Department of Energy to go building to building and green all of America's building. Do you guys remember seeing the trucks? No, because it didn't happen. So why didn't it work? Well, it turns out if you have two buildings that are the same building, same blueprint, same developer, same materials, they're next door to one another, and you have two different families move into the same building, 30 years later when you come back and try to reduce emissions, and you blow insulation into the attic of one building and into the building next door, you're going to reduce emissions by 10% in one building, but in the building next door, you're going to trap carbon monoxide and kill everybody. So you actually have to train a bunch of technicians to go building to building and do an analysis of the building, of the airflow, of the energy waste, of the fossil fuel consumption, to figure out the thermodynamics. And I talked to you're in physics, right? You got to figure out the airflow and the heat loss rate through the windows and walls in each and every building to figure out a kind of custom, unique sustainability package of upgrades for that building, because every building ends up being kind of like a unique, like a snowflake. And at the time, we didn't even really have iPhones. Apple had just come out with the first iPhone in like 2007. And so we just really weren't in a position to figure out how to solve this problem. And ultimately, we're not able to implement this massive building by building clean energy transformation. I was really frustrated by that. I worked on it for about 3 years as an outside consultant to the Department of Energy with these labor unions. We were not able to invest the $90 billion that they had set aside. We were not able to replace the $6 billion, $7 billion that Biden and Obama invested. Once it was spent, it was gone. And we did not create a robust green buildings industry. And that's a problem because buildings in America produce 30% of emissions. And so there just isn't a path to really navigating the climate crisis unless we figure out how to reduce emissions from buildings at scale. So I became really obsessed with this challenge and this opportunity, and decided that I was going to go to business school and learn enough about business to be dangerous and participate in solving this particular problem. It was frustrating to me. It seemed wasteful that we couldn't find a way to address this particular problem and reduce emissions from America's buildings. And so I went to Columbia Business School, and in my essay said, I want to start an organization that's going to focus on reducing emissions in buildings. Fortunately, they let me in. I did not know one thing about business. I didn't know what revenue was. I didn't know what stock was. If you asked me what is equity, I would have said something about social justice. But of course, equity also refers to ownership of a share in a corporation. And so I had a lot to learn about business, steep learning curve. Halfway through business school, decided to start my startup, BlocPower. And so for the last 10 years, we have been working on finding ways to green buildings across the country. We are now in about 45 cities, coast to coast. We're headquartered in New York. We focus on buildings in low and moderate income communities. Initially, we started focusing on energy efficiency to just bring down the emissions profile by 20 to 25%. But there's been a breakthrough piece of hardware developed over the last 5 or 6 years, the cold climate heat pump, that actually allows you to fully electrify buildings. And this heat pump can heat your home in the winter and reverse itself and cool your home in the summer. It's almost like an air conditioner that can go backwards and forwards and reverse. And it allows all of us to fully remove our buildings from fossil fuels. And as we said, this is really important because 30% of all emissions in America comes from buildings. So now if we can fully electrify buildings and remove all the buildings from fossil fuels, we no longer need like another moonshot. We have all of the hardware that we need to dramatically reduce America's emissions by 30%. So with the advent of this technology, we shifted BlocPower's focus to learning how to install these pieces of technology in buildings. Here in the Southeast, many buildings already have them. In the Northeast, in the Midwest, and in California, most buildings don't. Interestingly enough, the Biden administration, and Dr. McCoy was here this morning speaking at the 9 a.m. session, the Biden administration has committed to invest about $8.8 billion in helping America's shift from fossil fuels to heat pumps, to all electric buildings. And so the way we talk about it is you can turn a building into a Tesla. Just like Tesla and the electric vehicle industry has removed fossil fuel engines from vehicles and replace them with smart, modern, all-electric engines, we can now go building to building and remove all of the fossil fuel equipment, replace it with smart, modern, all-electric equipment, reduce emissions by 70, 80, 90%, and decarbonize buildings, and run those buildings from clean energy produced by solar and wind and hydropower. So that's part of the opportunity that's in front of us. There's other people who are doing really great work in transportation and agriculture. We are focusing on buildings. Ithaca, New York, along with hundreds of other cities, passed legislation during the Trump administration that they were going to take it upon themselves to go entirely net zero by the year 2030. Lots of cities said they were going to be net zero by 2050. Other cities said they were going to do it by 2040. And there's a couple hundred cities that are like crazy enough to try to do net zero by 2030. And Ithaca is definitely crazy. And so they put out an RFP, and we were crazy enough to apply for it, to say that we were going to help them achieve their 2030 goals. And so back to this vision of how do you go building to decarbonize every building. Think of the policy implications, think of the jobs that will be created. So that's one set of projects we have. And so we have 3 cities that we're working with to take them net zero by the year 2030. We're doing a project in LA where we're installing electric vehicle transportations across the city at a bunch of apartment buildings across the entire city, so that folks who may be driving for Uber during the day can charge up at night and electrify their vehicle fleet. So really starting to look at these city-scale clean energy projects to really green urban infrastructure. But I think it's really interesting to think about not only greening infrastructure in our urban communities or rural communities, but who's going to own and operate that infrastructure? And how do we think about historically disenfranchised communities owning and operating some of the green infrastructure that we're installing? So we're working on buying a few small construction firms and training the workers to become worker owners of these construction firms as they install EV chargers, or as they go building to install smart all-electric devices. We've created a credit line with Goldman and Microsoft. It's about $100 million, where we borrow capital and pay workers to install all-electric equipment in buildings where those buildings may not be able to afford it themselves. And we're really looking forward to the opportunity that the Biden administration has provided, because in our view, and I'll stop here and take some questions, but in our view, the Inflation Reduction Act, which Dr. McCoy has spoken about and other folks spoke about today, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be about as good as it gets for a while. This is our moment. This is our opportunity for you guys to really seize the mantle and seize control and understand what's in that legislation and understand what it allows all of us to do. Fundamentally, it allows us to decarbonize buildings and transportation. It allows us to decentralize the energy system. What do I mean by that? So you can go to IBM headquarters and look at one of the original computers, and this is like giant computer in a room this big. Computing used to be big. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my mom bought a PC and it was huge. Now we have phones that are the size of credit cards, and they have more computing power than all of those computers combined, right? Computing has been decentralized from something that, the military used to control and do, to something that any 6-year-old can figure out how to do really great computing with smartphone products. Computing is now decentralized. Or if you look at media, I'm old enough to remember when, if you wanted to learn what was going on, you had to, like I saw with Kate Middleton today, we all thought crazy stuff was going on with her. Turns out she was sick with cancer. Well, I'm old enough to remember when you had to learn stuff like that on the 6 o'clock news, and that was like the only way to find out what was happening. But now all of you produce your own news. The news media has moved from being centralized, produced by a few people and distributed, to news can be created and distributed by all of us. It's decentralized. So the same thing is happening to the energy industry. Your professor may agree or disagree. But energy is produced centrally and then distributed to all of us. And it's produced by burning fossil fuels and hydrocarbons and sending that energy out to us through the centralized grid. The energy, as we move forward 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows how long it's going to take. We hope with your efforts it's going to move quickly. Energy is going to be decentralized. It's going to be controlled and owned and operated by individual folks in their homes with their solar and their batteries and their EV charger and their electric heat pumps that produce and store and sell electricity from one home to another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all that is in the IRA, from the chips and the software needed to do that, which is in the CHIPS Act, to the giant infrastructure projects, which is in the infrastructure bill, to the home-by-home work that's in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so as a generation, I think what I want to share is you guys have a lot of work in front of you, but you also have a massive opportunity to really be one of the greatest generations and really pursue distributed clean energy. Clean energy that's distributed not only physically, but also in who owns it and who operates it to solve historical inequalities. And so your generation can pull that off. That's the opportunity that President Biden has created for all of us. And I certainly want to be allied with you. If there's any questions or ways that I can help you guys as you move forward, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You have to put my name in and my email address, but it's donnelbaird@gmail.com as my email, and I'm happy to answer questions on LinkedIn, distributed platform, but also happy to take questions now if we have a little time. Thank you.
Hi. Oh, okay, I'll talk a little bit lower. Okay, so my original question was going to be more kind of central energy produced, where you just commented, and I think I need to reframe it a little bit. So one of the problems that I'm aware of under the current distribution of energy is how you need to provide the energy, but it's difficult to store that. So we use models to predict and forecast how that is distributed and when that energy is produced. Ideally, that's made in a green setting, but primarily we're using coal since that's more efficient time-wise. So I was hoping you would try to describe a little bit more about how that technology related to the heat pump works, because my understanding is that we have a heat pump and that is a machine that would require some type of power source, and how we would get that energy to them, because my current framework is there needs to be some type of centralized unit to distribute to our new decentralized unit.
I thought you were going to ask a softball question, man. Jesus Christ. I'm going to try to not answer this in a complicated, controversial way. I'll say solar PV in many ways is an inefficient technology. And so as you look around the world, solar thermal, if you go into the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, or if you go into the middle of Istanbul, solar hot water is a more prevalent technology. But beyond that, solar thermal, the capture and transfer and storage of solar heat is more efficient than solar PV, right? You have lower loss rates. And so there's lots of folks who are working on heat transfer and heat storage technologies that are really, really interesting to us. So that's the second part. We are working with the Department of Energy. We are installing thermal batteries alongside heat pumps, and we have a project in Syracuse, New York, where we've put in a bunch of heat pumps that are electrifying the building, and then we're working with the national laboratories, the folks who invented the atomic bomb. You guys have seen Oppenheimer. Well, a lot of those folks are researching clean energy, and so there's new technologies coming out all the time. One of the battery technologies that we're really interested in is Fervo, F-E-R-V-O. They're using iron as battery storage, and there's another awesome company. I can't remember the name because I'm jet lagged, been traveling all week, but they're actually using bricks as batteries. And so as we move away from lithium I had the chance to go to visit the Democratic Republic of Congo. We don't want to keep relying on lithium. So as we invent new kinds of battery hardware that are using different kinds of storage and different kinds of materials, bricks, iron, stuff that's more freely available, that's really going to bring down the cost curve for batteries and really be a really critical part of a distributed grid. And then distributed solar PV or solar thermal is going to be a really important part of that, and ideally geothermal as well. So the energy mix in 15, 20 years is going to look very, very different than it does right now, assuming that there is battery storage and thermal storage and increased geothermal access. So things are going to look really different. The question is, how soon will it look different? And will it happen in time to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis? You, and then you. Yeah. Go ahead.
So are you heat pumps, Johnson Controls, is that a company that you work with to get heat pumps, or are they more commercial than you?
Yeah. So the question is, do we work with Johnson Control? So Johnson Control is an energy services company that works with big buildings, schools, universities. They'll sign contracts to lower energy bills and make investments to do that and guarantee a certain amount of energy savings. We work with small and mid-sized buildings. So there's 5 million medium-sized buildings that are smaller than a skyscraper, right? And Johnson Control is really good at skyscrapers and really big buildings, smaller than a university auditorium. So it's a local church or local temple or synagogue or a KFC or an apartment building. So there's 5 million of these kind of medium-sized buildings, and they aren't really serviced, and so we focus on those buildings.
I was wondering have you run into any challenges, or do you foresee any challenges regarding scalability, especially with working with municipal governments? Just because I could see how this green development space could be maybe politicized. I don't know if you've run into anything related to that.
Say more about, expand on the politicization. What do you mean? That certain municipalities, it's too political, it's a hot topic, people don't want to get into it?
Or that sometimes, some people don't want to necessarily invest in green things or make the green shift. There's some pushback and struggle to reach that
Got it.
position.
Got it.
Yeah, or have you been working with private sector? Let's go.
Got it. So I'll give 2 answers to that. In terms of scalability to your first question, we've worked with the Department of Energy to build a digital model of every building in America. And so we have all of the data on every building in America. We have satellite data, Google Street View data, we have LiDAR data, we have mortgage data, property tax assessment data, and we associate all of that data with digital twins of each and every building in America. And we've built AI that allows us to go building by building and make recommendations as to how to green or decarbonize that individual building. Because every building is a snowflake, but we do need to have a scalable approach to help homeowners and families and everybody to green their building, rabbi, pastor, imam, whoever. And so scalability, we think, can be achieved in part through software. And we didn't have access to cloud computing and mobile computing and AI back in the Obama administration, so we just couldn't pull all this stuff off back then. But we can do it now because the costs have come down and the technology is available. In terms of politicization, energy is going to continue to be politicized. I was in Houston 4 days this week for the first time ever. It was very educational for me to talk to oil and gas folks about how they live their life. My buddy Van Jones says, oil and gas people are different, man. Their energy is different. They pull dead shit out of the ground and burn it. They're just different they're different from us, different vibes from clean energy people. No disrespect. So, a little bit. They are cooking the planet. We're all gonna die. So, interestingly enough, even in the heart of Houston, Texas, they've created new clean tech venture capital funds where all of the oil and gas majors, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in clean tech venture capitalists to provide early stage investments to climate startups. I met with one. They're like, we want to invest. I was like, do I really want to, but, there's interesting opportunities there. So that's one part. We don't think that, at my company, we do not believe that talking to customers about climate change, whether they are Democrat or Republican or independent, like that is a waste of time. What we want to talk to people about is like, hey, you have a gas oven and a gas hot water heater. When you burn gas in your home, it releases benzene, nitrogen dioxide, and methane. And you and your children are breathing that in every night, whether or not that furnace is on or whether or not that oven is on, like that's what you're breathing in. That's why 13% of asthma in America is caused by nitrogen dioxide from gas appliances in your home. And that is the reason that you need to electrify your home. So we're talking to a totally different part of our customers' brains. We're not talking to them about climate change. Now, for some people, oh, by the way, it happens to be good for the planet, and people care about that. Some people do, some people don't. But everybody cares about their kids. And so as business leaders, we gotta try to meet people where they are, regardless of whether they agree with us politically or not. That said, it's actually Republican states who are states that are, Marjorie Taylor Greene, like the craziest Trump congresswoman out there. She's a fucking nut. She has a solar factory in her district, and she voted against all the bills and didn't want to blah, 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 blah. But there's thousands of jobs in her district, solar jobs, clean energy jobs. So she's pro that solar factory. Even though she's a right-wing MAGA crazy person, she's pro-solar in her district. And so what does it mean to politicize this stuff, right? The lion's share of Americans are aware of and alarmed about climate change. The Yale School of Climate Communications, I was talking to them last week. Most Americans, even people who believe in climate change, underestimate the amount of other Americans who believe in climate change. So we all think that no one else believes in climate change, when the truth is everyone else believes in climate change, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on politically. And there's a very small group of people, largely funded by the oil and gas industries, who have vested interest in pretending that's not the case. But the vast majority of Americans, close to 70% of Americans, are aware of and believe in climate change. So that's one of the things to remember. Other questions?
Two more.
Or you guys can ask a couple of them, and then I'll try to answer as best I can. Yeah. Go ahead.
Your business model really includes making sure that minorities are well represented in the work that you do, and like people who are typically underrepresented in this like progressive and growth and experiencing new technologies. So like how do we, I guess as like small at the university level or just like continuing on into like the workforce, make sure that that's something that's like carried over and like regular and well respected? Like I really just wanted to know more about how you implement that, like how to be equitable through your implementation of these heat pumps and technology, and like do you just go by like a building by building basis, or is this something that you specifically look for in like underrepresented communities who are experiencing like a bigger weight of this, like people who heat their houses with their open oven type stuff?
Yeah, so great question, man. I think when we talk about equity, we include everyone. So that includes Caucasians in rural America as well, because they are financially underserved as well. Whether we all like to pretend that's not the case or not, they are, and that's why we have the political conditions that we have in this country right now, because those folks are not being served. And so when we talk about equity, we definitely include those communities as well. When you look at which buildings overconsume energy per square foot, it's like a mansion with a heated swimming pool and consume a lot of energy. And then it's like low-income buildings where you may have like 15 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment, and people aren't working, and a bunch of people are home all day and taking showers and watching TV and using up the electricity, right? And so the buildings that overconsume energy per square foot is this bell curve, right, of low-income buildings and hyper-affluent buildings. And so just from a pure emissions reduction standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint, when you're thinking about, which buildings should we serve, it's not a bad business strategy to serve both of those customers. It's almost like a Tom Shoes model. hey, you buy a pair of Tom shoes and we're going to donate some shoes in, Kenya. I'm not being flip. How do you do that? It's Friday afternoon. How do you do that? How do you do that for clean energy? Look, we're going to come in and help you reduce emissions for your heated swimming pool and make sure that the electricity charging your Tesla is clean. And we're going to use some of the revenue and the net income and profits from that transaction to help subsidize and offset the high upfront costs of these lower income buildings. So we got to serve everybody, and clean energy must be mass market. It has to be for everybody. Brother, you had a question?
Yeah.
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, awesome. I wanted to talk about the social impacts that you see. So can you expand on those specifically for like underserved communities? And I think I also wanted to know, how you track them and how you plan to kind of measure that in the future.
Like a methodology? Well, one of the things we're very focused on is creating a new carbon offset model. If Microsoft or Apple, I don't know if UNC buys carbon offsets, should the carbon offsets come from maybe this farmer chopped down a tree in the Amazon? Did he or did she? We don't know. The tree got chopped down. We thought the tree was going to get chopped down, but it didn't. It's still there, but now it's not. And we don't know. But if you green a building in Chapel Hill or Durham and decarbonize it and reduce its emission by 70%, you know how much fossil fuels it was burning before, and you know how many fossil fuels you've reduced it by because you've upgraded it and made it all electric. So that delta is avoided carbon emissions, and that can also be sold. If you look at Tesla actually made far more money from the sale of these carbon credits than they made from selling vehicles. So if you look at their business, they made billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars over 10 years from selling the offsets from the sale of their electric cars to companies that were polluting and had to pay to offset that pollution. They made more money from that than selling the vehicles. So not only how do you track impact, but how do you think about it as a business strategy to monetize it? I'll give you another quick example, which I hope can answer your other question. In the Bronx, we have the highest childhood asthma rate in America, in the poorest congressional district in America, interestingly enough. The Bronx has 5,000 apartment buildings that burn oil for heat and for hot water. So that means that a truck filled with oil pulls up, pumps oil into the basement, into the boiler, and then they burn it, produces heat and hot water and steam, and that's what they use to cook and clean with, take showers, and that's also what they use for heat in the winter. So every day they're burning oil. Then the Bronx has a food distribution system, a bunch of warehouses. So you have these 18-wheel trucks that pull in from New Jersey and Connecticut and Pennsylvania and all over the region and kind of run their engines, and so they're polluting as well. So Bronx has the highest asthma rates in America, which also means that its hospital emergency rooms lose a ton of money treating children who are having chronic asthma attacks who come into the emergency room having asthma. It's super expensive and super costly for every hospital system in the Bronx. It's super expensive for the health insurance providers and for the government that provides Medicare and Medicaid. I can never remember which one's for old people, which one's for everybody. Anyway, it's super expensive, right? And to treat these conditions of asthma. So if you go in and you identify the 5,000 buildings that are burning oil, and you move them from burning oil to burning clean, all electric, right? Electricity. You're reducing the amount of local pollution in the Bronx, which also reduces the amount of chronic asthmatics who live in the Bronx, which reduces the amount of emergency room utilization, which ends up saving a ton of taxpayer dollars in Medicare and Medicaid payments, which again is bipartisan. Everybody can agree with reducing healthcare costs and government spend, right? And so as you track the potential impact of green buildings investment, how do you think about, if we invest $200,000 in moving this particular building from oil to all electric operations and equipment, what are the avoided emissions going to be? Can we sell those to Apple? What are the avoided pollution going to be and avoided emergency room visits going to be? Can we sell that to the health insurance company that's benefiting from an increased profitability because of that impact, right? So it's being thoughtful about quantifying and then monetizing the impact that is created by taking a broader view of the full stakeholders of clean energy. So that allows us to, again, have a different kind of conversation about climate change and clean energy or not, or Republican versus Democrat or whatever. Like, we're talking about the full spectrum of impact and meeting people's needs in different ways. So, I was really delighted to be here with all of you. Oh, did you have a question? Go ahead.
What happens to the heat pumps after, like, at their end of life?
Heat pumps last 10 to 15 years. We're cutting a deal. The sister, she's a Caucasian sister who is out of New York. She's making long-term kind of steel water containers to get rid of plastic cups. And she's like, everybody should have their own cup. It should be on the blockchain, and it's your cup. You carry it around with you everywhere. So she's doing this, and so we're recycling the metal from that into these things. So we are starting to work on that. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you guys. Reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have questions that I didn't get to you. I'm on LinkedIn, so you type in my name, donn.el.baird@gmail.com, and then we'll be able to connect, and I look forward to answering you guys' questions and being connected with you online. Thanks.